Hi, welcome to our presentation. Today I'll be talking about our paper ShapeAssembly, learning how to generate programs for 3D shape structure synthesis. This is joint work with Tessa Barton, Xianghao, Kai Wang, Ellen Jiang, Paul Guerrero, Niloy Mitra, and Daniel Ritchie. We studied the problem of 3D shape generation, so why is it important? The demand for high-quality 3D content has never been higher. In addition to traditional consumers of 3D data for computer graphics applications like entertainment and game systems, emerging technologies like AR and VR are also increasingly reliant on 3D content for interaction-based applications. More recently, many artificial intelligence systems are also looking towards 3D synthetic data to help train supervised learning systems that, for instance, want to semantically segment a scene, or teach a robot how to interact with 3D objects. The problem is that making 3D content by hand is difficult. Manually authoring a good 3D model is time-intensive and requires expensive expertise. As a result, this approach cannot scale to meet the increasing demand. One possible way forward here is to look towards generative models of 3D data. For this talk, we will think about these methods as procedures that are capable of automatically creating novel 3D objects. Traditionally, there have been two dominant approaches to generating 3D shapes. The first one I'll talk about is procedural modeling. We can think of procedural methods as structured computer programs, often grammars, that can be executed to create novel shape instances within a certain class of shapes. With the right rule set, procedural models can create high-quality geometry by construction, and their programmatic representational form allows for intuitive editing. However, authoring a good procedural model is a difficult task, and the amount of shape variability present in any single procedural model is often limited. On the other end of the spectrum are neural learning methods. These are mostly deep neural networks that train on large collections of 3D shapes. In the last few years, these methods have demonstrated some truly impressive results, as they are able to capture complex and variable shape distributions with little human effort beyond data acquisition. However, as neural methods lack the strict semantics of a procedural form, their outputs can contain noise artifacts, such as incomplete geometry or floating parts. Additionally, the representations they learn are typically inscrutable to people, making them hard to edit or manipulate in predictable ways. Comparing the two approaches, we see their strengths are mirrors of each other's weaknesses. Neural models are highly expressive and flexible in capturing varied shape collections, but the representational form of procedural models is much more amenable to shape manipulation, and operating in a procedural language can help avoid noisy artifacts that can plague the outputs of learned models. Our question, which we explore in this work, is whether it's possible to get the benefits of these methods while avoiding the negatives. Our idea is to create a neural-procedural system that learns how to write programs. Our approach uses a deep neural network that writes programs in a domain-specific language that, when executed, output 3D shape structures. This approach gives us the best of both worlds. The procedural programs no longer need to be manually authored, and the latent space of the learned model will capture any variability that the symbolic program does not. Yet, as our output representation is a structured program, we maintain the advantages of the procedural method. One central challenge that we have to deal with is the question of how to train such a model without a dataset of ground truth programs of 3D shapes. To overcome this, we manually design a domain-specific language, or DSL, for 3D shape structure generation, and then use it to construct a dataset of programs that we can train a generative model from. So, to give a more holistic view of our approach, as input, our method consumes 3D shape structures represented as part graphs that capture part-to-part relationships such as connectivity and symmetry. These graphs represent hierarchy in the form of parent-child edges, where an intermediate coarse part, such as a chair base, can decompose into finer-grained subparts, such as the chair legs. Our method uses the semantic hierarchies defined in PartNet and focuses on manufactured objects. Following StructureNet, we abstract the dense geometry of parts with part proxy bounding volumes, as we are primarily concerned with synthesizing shape structure. Next, we define a domain-specific language for 3D shapes that is based around instantiating parts and attaching them to one another called ShapeAssembly. Using the ShapeAssembly language, we construct a dataset of programs that, when executed, recreate the shapes in our input part hierarchies. We use this dataset to train a deep neural network that learns how to write programs in ShapeAssembly. Once it is trained, we can use our model to create new ShapeAssembly programs that, when executed, synthesize novel 3D shape structures. First, let's take a look at our procedural language. ShapeAssembly is an assembly language for shapes. It's a low-level language for creating shapes, in which shapes are themselves made through assembling parts. ShapeAssembly is able to create complex 3D shape structures through two principal operations. The Cuboid Operator creates a coarse part proxy cuboid with a specified width, height, and depth that is initialized at the origin. The Attach Operator is what forms structures. Attaches are specified through attachment points within a part, visualized as red dots. Each attach command moves a source cuboid to connect to a target cuboid, potentially translating, scaling, or rotating the source cuboid to satisfy the spatial relationship. In addition to these base functions, ShapeAssembly also contains macros, capturing common structural patterns that decompose into potentially multiple cuboid and attach function calls. For instance, the squeeze macro squeezes a part in between the faces of two other parts by decomposing into two attach operations. ShapeAssembly also contains support for symmetry macros, such as reflection and translation, that form parts with symmetrical relationships by, once again, decomposing into multiple cuboid and attach functions. The commands of ShapeAssembly are executed imperatively to form 3D shape structures. ShapeAssembly supports hierarchical programs. Any cuboid can expand into its subroutine program where the cuboid becomes the bounding volume for finer grained parts. In this example, the gray back part in the root program becomes the bounding volume of the more detailed subprogram consisting of 3 gold vertical slats and a smaller purple back surface. By using hierarchical subroutines that can represent parts at multiple levels of granularity, our programs are more consistent across shape collections, and they are easier to understand and interact with. Now, we'll look at how we get our dataset of shape programs. Our goal in this step is to find ShapeAssembly programs that, when executed, recreate the geometry of shape instances found in PartNet. As a running example, we can consider this chair from PartNet, and specifically, we might be interested in the program corresponding to its back part. Our procedure to infer program attributes is based on geometric analysis that takes a part hierarchy as input. In this example, the orange parts are the chair back surface, and the blue parts are the chair back frame. We attempt to regularize the input hierarchies by first flattening them, where we restructure the hierarchy so that leaf parts with spatial relationships are more often siblings. Then, in the shortening step, we decrease the dimensions of leaf parts that fully interpenetrate other leaf parts in order to create more surface-to-surface connections. This simplifies the learning task for our model and creates more regular training programs. Next, we find all intersecting part pairs and locate attachment points for each connection. We identify symmetry groups of parts that share a symmetrical relationship that can be expressed through attachment. Each group is represented by a transform applied to a single part, and all other members are removed from the graph. With parts to attributes, a final program is proposed, and a procedure validates that the executed program accurately represents the input shape. We then use the extracted programs to train our generative model. Our generative model is a sequence-to-sequence variational autoencoder. The encoder branch embeds a ShapeAssembly program into a latent space. The decoder branch converts a point in this latent space into a ShapeAssembly program. The decoder predicts programs by taking a latent vector z as input. The z vector is fed to a gated recurrent unit, or GRU cell, that sends its output to a line decoder module that outputs a ShapeAssembly program line. This program line is then re-encoded and fed back into the GRU cell at the next time step. This process repeats recurrently until a special stop token is predicted. For each cuboid line, another module predicts if that part should have a subprogram or if it's just a leaf. When a subprogram is predicted, we recursively run this procedure, and in this way, a hierarchical ShapeAssembly program is predicted. The architecture of the encoder is then basically just a mirrored version of the decoder, where the inputs and outputs are swapped. We use our collection of extracted ShapeAssembly programs to train our model in a supervised fashion on the program attributes, such as the discrete decisions in the program structure and the continuous values of the program's parameters. Once our model is trained on our dataset of shape programs, we are able to create novel 3D shape structures with our model by sampling ShapeAssembly programs and then executing them to get their output geometry. These are 8 samples from our model across the chair, table, and storage furniture categories of PartNet. To check our model's generative capabilities, we can compare our generated shapes against their geometric nearest neighbor in the training set using a chamfer distance metric, or against the program nearest neighbor of each shape by calculating an edit distance metric on the structural components of a shape assembly program. As seen, our model learns to produce plausible 3D shapes with wide ranges of part-to-part relationships and high structural diversity. Our nearest neighbor comparisons show that our model learns to generalize both geometrically and structurally beyond the data instances it learned from. We compare the shapes generated by our method to 2 recent systems that produce 3D shape structures directly without an intermediate program representation. 3D-PRNN is a method that uses a recurrent neural network to predict parts as oriented cuboids. StructureNet is a method that uses graph neural networks to predict a hierarchy of parameterized cuboids. On the whole, our method generates nicer and more regularized shapes. There are 2 primary reasons for this. First, our program representation provides an inductive bias that simplifies the learning task as we learn in a regularized program space instead of on 3D geometry directly. Moreover, the form of our DSL also biases our method towards producing more plausible and physically correct shapes by only allowing structures to be created by attaching parts to one another. Methods that lack this explicit bias more often exhibit failure cases where parts become disconnected or intersect in an implausible fashion. We run a quantitative study on each method's generations and find that our generations have the best physical validity and are more plausible than those of other methods. Programs, by way of representational form, allow for easy semantic editing of generated output. Here, we show how just by editing the continuous parameters of a shape assembly program, a wide range of 3D shape structures can be explored. We show some additional samples from our generative model and more edited variants that were once again produced only by manipulating the program's parameters. As seen, a single program structure captures a family of related shapes that can be explored by editing the program's parameterization. As our model is able to decode a single high-dimensional vector into a hierarchical shape assembly program, we can take 2 distinct shapes and interpolate between them by decoding latent vectors along the path from the start shape to an end shape, even if they are structurally different. While this interpolation happens in the shape assembly program space, we can visualize it by executing these programs. These sequences illustrate both smooth continuous and discrete structural transitions, all the while maintaining part-to-part attachments. For instance, as highlighted in the yellow line, the part dimensions of the back surface gradually decrease. On the other hand, as shown in the green highlight, once the height of the back surface becomes too small, a semantic discrete transition is made, and the reflectional symmetry group of 2 back slats becomes a translational symmetry group of 4 back slats. We can also compare our interpolation sequences between ground truth shapes from the validation set. Here is the shape assembly sequence, and here is the StructureNet sequence. The disentanglement between structure and parameters in our shape program representation allows for smoother, more semantic interpolations between shapes with similar structures but different geometry. We consider another interpolation sequence between 2 chairs with different topologies. Here is the shape assembly sequence and the StructureNet sequence. We once again see that the shape assembly interpolation makes semantically valid discrete transitions, for instance, the gradual increase in the number of back slats, all the while maintaining a physically valid and plausible shape structure. As an application, we explore how we can infer a shape assembly program from unstructured geometry, such as a point cloud. To accomplish this, we train a PointNet++ model to map point cloud samplings of PartNet data into the latent space of our trained generative model. We can then decode these latent vectors into shape assembly programs, which can be executed to get output geometry that plausibly explains the reference point cloud. We can see that while this process might get the program structure correct, the program's parameters can be wrong. To refine the program to better match the target point cloud, we can find new continuous parameters of the program that minimize some metric, such as chamfer distance with respect to the target. In order to find these new parameter values, we make use of the fact that our shape assembly executor is differentiable with respect to the continuous parameters. This allows us to directly optimize these parameters to minimize the chamfer distance of the generated shape program geometry against the target geometry through gradient descent. So, in conclusion, The main takeaway message is that there are substantial benefits to combining elements of neural and procedural generative methods. Our ShapeAssembly method is able to achieve the flexibility and expressivity of neural systems while maintaining an interpretable representational form that allows for easy shape manipulation. We show that learning within a space of shape programs simplifies and regularizes the learning task, as it allows an explicit disentanglement of shape structure from parameterization. We also demonstrate how using a procedural representation allows for explicit control over the inductive biases of the learning method. For instance, we designed ShapeAssembly with a strong inductive bias for part connectivity, and as a result, our generated shapes excel in related metrics. We view ShapeAssembly as a first-step exploration of how to best combine neural and procedural techniques, and there are many exciting avenues of future work. One important future direction is developing a method to turn these 3D shape structures into dense geometry. We've done some exploration in this space with generating a point cloud per part, and some details like curvature do begin to emerge, but there is quite a lot of work left to be done. One promising direction is on how a learned implicit function, say something like IMNet, could be integrated with our structured shape program representation. Our method is currently reliant on datasets of 3D shapes with fine-grained part-level annotations, such as PartNet. We use this annotation to create a dataset of ground truth programs our model learns from. Future work that either removes the need to train on programs directly or allows for training on more varied datasets of 3D shapes with less annotation, such as StructureNet, are promising directions of exploration. Our ShapeAssembly domain-specific language is manually designed, but there may be ways to improve it or specialize it for a particular task or dataset. One way forward here is to develop methods that can automatically discover procedural shape languages that are amenable to specific neural-procedural modeling tasks. Finally, our shape programs not only define a shape structure, but also specify where part-to-part connections occur. This information may confer distinct advantages for methods that want to annotate parts in a shape structure with kinematic or dynamic articulations. For instance, you could imagine replacing the general attachments in ShapeAssembly with joints that specify the types or allowable motions between parts. We have a project page for ShapeAssembly, which can be found at the listed address. Links to our data, GitHub code, and an interactive editor for the ShapeAssembly language, as shown in the video, can all be found there. Thank you all for listening. Please feel free to reach out for additional information, questions, or clarifications.